Hello everyone, wishing you a peaceful and beautiful day. On the way home after a warm family meal, when the sudden rain fell and Tu Diem collapsed from exhaustion on Toan's back, he realized that what he feared most was not poverty, but the moment he might not be strong enough to keep her safe. Now let's discover the story of Toan and Tu Diem together. Will that silent promise be enough to carry them through the uncertain days ahead? And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The road that led away from Thu's mother's house still carried the warmth of voices behind them, the scent of freshly cooked rice and braised chicken lingering in the air as if the wooden door had not fully closed, leaving a thin line of light in memory. Yet with every step forward, the evening gathered them into the familiar quiet of the countryside. The sky lowered into a soft grey, and the wind moved steadily across the fields, bringing with it the smell of damp soil and distant cooking smoke. And without saying anything, Toan slowed his pace so Tu Diem would not need to hurry, the space between them always close enough for him to reach her if she faltered. She was still talking, still holding on to the feeling of being welcomed at the table, repeating how natural it had felt when someone had placed food into her bowl, how strange and comforting it was to sit among people and not feel like a guest. Yet the strength in her voice thinned, and her steps began to shorten, the rhythm between her words breaking into small pauses. When they reached the stretch of bamboo fence where the path curved gently, she rested her hand against the smooth green surface and left it there longer than necessary, her head lowering slightly before she said she felt lightheaded. Toan stopped immediately and turned fully toward her, the calm he always carried tightening into something more fragile, though he spoke softly and told her it was only the fatigue of a long day. They tried to continue, but after a few steps, her balance shifted, and she sank down onto the low edge of the path, her shoulders dropping as if the air around them had suddenly grown heavier. The first drops of rain arrived without sound, small dark circles forming on the dust before spreading across their clothes. Toan crouched in front of her and called her name, one hand supporting her back while the other brushed the damp strands of hair away from her face. Her skin felt cooler than before, and her breathing came in shallow waves that did not quite fill her chest. A motorbike approached slowly and stopped beside them, and Han from the neighborhood removed her helmet and took in the scene in a single glance. The kind of understanding that comes from having witnessed many such moments in a lifetime. She did not ask questions. She simply told him to take her to the clinic immediately, her voice firm enough to leave no space for hesitation. Toan turned and lowered himself so Tu Diem could climb onto his back, and when he lifted her, he felt how completely her weight rested on him, not resisting, not trying to help, trusting him in a way that made his steps heavier with responsibility rather than effort. The rain thickened into a fine curtain that blurred the edges of the path. The dirt beneath his feet softened and shifted, and each step required care and balance. His breathing remained even but deeper, drawn from determination, his shoulders leaning forward as the slope changed, his grip beneath her knees never loosening. Tu Diem's cheek pressed against his shoulder, and her eyes closed. Not in sleep, but in the quiet surrender of someone who no longer tried to hold herself upright. Her hands tightened whenever his foot slipped on the wet ground, and each time he steadied himself before continuing, the rhythm of his steps merging with the sound of the rain. The distance to the clinic seemed longer than it had ever been, familiar turns passing more slowly, and when the white light of the small building appeared ahead through the mist, he moved faster without realizing it. Inside, the narrow room smelled of disinfectant and old wood, the fan on the ceiling turning with a dull, repetitive click that filled the silence. The nurse guided Tu Diem onto the bed and began to check her pulse and blood pressure. Speaking in a calm voice, that belonged to someone accustomed to worry. Toan stood beside her, his hand resting on the metal frame, his eyes never leaving her face. The diagnosis was simple: exhaustion, low blood pressure, nothing serious. But the minutes before, those words had stretched into something that forced him to imagine what he had never allowed himself to imagine. Outside, beneath the small roof of the shop, he opened his wallet and counted the remaining notes once, then again, as if the number might change. They were not enough. The realization settled into him without movement. The shopkeeper, too, watched in silence and placed the medicine on the counter, telling him to take it and bring the money later. The gesture was ordinary, almost casual, yet it struck deeper than any reproach. Toan bowed his head slightly before returning to the clinic. When Tu Diem opened her eyes, she found him sitting close, his chair drawn nearer than before, his fingers resting along the edge of the mattress, as if he had not dared to touch her again until he knew she was fully awake. He told her quietly that he had been thinking too far ahead, believing that taking care of her meant building something larger in the future and forgetting to notice when she needed him in the present. She listened without interrupting and then reached for his hand, the warmth of her palm closing around his, erasing the cold that had followed him from the rain. By the time they left the clinic, the rain had softened into a thin mist that hovered above the ground. The village lights appeared one by one along the path home, their reflections trembling in the puddles. When they entered the yard, the familiar shape of the house stood waiting, yet the air inside carried the tension of news that had arrived before them. A relative spoke with concern that turned into gentle reproach, asking why she had been taken so far while still tired. Toan did not answer. He stood quietly, accepting the words as if they belonged to him alone. Then Tu Diem spoke, her voice calm but firm, saying it had been her decision, that he had never let her suffer. The room fell silent because of the certainty in her tone. The electricity went out as they prepared for dinner, and a kerosene lamp was placed at the center of the table, its flame moving slightly whenever the wind slipped through the cracks in the door. The light softened every face and removed the sharpness from the earlier tension. Toan brought her a bowl of porridge and sat beside her, moving the fan slowly so the air would not chill her. The same relative who had spoken earlier placed food into his bowl without looking at him, a gesture that carried more meaning than an apology. Outside, the rain continued in a steady line, its sound blending with the small noises of spoons and quiet conversation. Later, when they lay down to rest, the room held the warmth that comes after a long day that has tested every fear and returned it gently to silence. Toan pulled the blanket up around her, smoothing it across her shoulder with the care of someone who had learned something that would remain with him. She whispered that having him beside her was enough. He did not answer, but his hand remained there a moment longer, and beyond the window the rain fell in a calm, even rhythm, as if marking the end of a day in which they had crossed another unseen distance together without letting go. That night passed under the steady sound of rain on the metal roof, a familiar rhythm of the countryside, yet enough to keep Toan from sleeping deeply. He woke several times only to turn and look at Tu Diem lying beside him, each time his hand reached instinctively to pull the blanket higher, even though she was not cold. The next morning the sky was still pale and heavy. The yard smelled of wet soil. Tu Diem was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, tying her hair slowly, her face carrying a quiet freshness that made Toan stand at the doorway, watching her for a long moment without speaking. She turned, smiled, and said yesterday was only fatigue and that she wanted to step out to the small garden for some air. He did not stop her, but walked close behind as if distance had become something he no longer trusted. The garden still held pools of rainwater, vegetable rows bent low, a few broken flower branches lying in the soft ground. She knelt to lift them upright one by one, her hands covered with mud, yet her attention calm as though this small act could restore balance inside her. Toan brought a wooden chair under the eaves and told her to sit, then rolled up his sleeves and gathered the fallen branches himself, his movements steady, turning back often to check that she was still there. The relative from the night before stepped out with a cup of warm water, her voice gentler now as she asked if Tu Diem still felt tired, a simple question that made her pause for a second before answering with a quiet smile that she was fine. Breakfast was plain with hot porridge and pickled vegetables. Toan sat across from her, but did not begin eating until he saw her finish her bowl. After the meal, his phone rang, a call from someone in town saying there was a temporary job available for a few months, not big but stable. He stood outside listening for a long time, his voice low and firm, and when he came back inside, there was a subtle change in his eyes that Tu Diem immediately noticed. He said he would go down in the afternoon just to ask and see. Not for long, she nodded without asking anything more, and only reminded him to bring a raincoat because the sky had not fully cleared. The noon hours passed in familiar quiet. Toan cleaned the motorbike in the yard, wiping away the mud from the previous day, checking the brakes and wheels as if preparing for a longer journey than the road to town. Before leaving, he stood at the doorway watching her folding clothes and told her to rest. If she felt tired, she nodded with a small movement that was enough to reassure him. The road to town after the long rain looked cleaner, puddles reflecting the pale sky. He rode slower than usual, and at every stop he took out his phone to check for messages from her. At home, Tu Diem sat under the front eaves, the old bamboo chair creaking softly as she leaned back. The relative brought a basket of beans for her to sort, the two women sitting side by side without many words. The silence no longer heavy but settled. When Toan returned in the late afternoon, the motorbike had barely stopped at the gate before she stood up. The expectation clear in her eyes, he walked in, took off his helmet, his face still damp with sweat, but his smile unmistakable. He said the job would not start immediately, but they had agreed to take him in, and that in a few days he would go down to sign the papers. The simple sentence filled the house with a new brightness. Dinner that evening had a hot soup added. The relative served food for both of them. Without mentioning the previous night, Toan spoke slowly about the new workplace, the road to town, what he would try to build, his voice not loud but steady. When night came and the rain had stopped, they stood together in the yard for a long time, the air clearer, insects calling from the fields. Tu Diem moved closer, her hand touching his as if it had always belonged there. He admitted he had been afraid the day before, not of the slippery road or the rain, but of the possibility that he might not be able to keep her safe. She shook her head and said her peace had never depended on money or a house, but on opening her eyes and still seeing him beside her. The words left him silent for a long time before he tightened his hold on her hand in a promise that did not need to be spoken. That night there was no rain. The room was dark but warm. They lay closer than usual, Toan no longer waking repeatedly. Tu Diem's breathing even and deep, her hand resting on his arm as if it had always been there. Outside, the sky slowly cleared after days of rain, the road ahead still uncertain. Yet inside that small room, there was a certainty that felt real. The certainty of two people who had walked through a long day of worry, reproach, hope, and a new promise for the days to come.
Sau bữa cơm Tết ấm áp, Toàn và Từ Diễm rời nhà bác gái trong dư âm sum họp. Nhưng biến cố bất ngờ xảy ra khi cô kiệt sức trên đường. Trong cơn mơ, Toàn cõng cô đến trạm xá với nỗi sợ lần đầu hiện rõ, để rồi nhẹ nhõm khi biết chỉ là sự tụt huyết áp. Sự thiếu tiền mua thuốc khiến anh lặng người, nhưng tình làng nghĩa xóm đã giúp họ vượt qua. Trở về nhà, Toan im lặng nhận lời trách, còn Tứ Diễm lần đầu mạnh mẽ bảo vệ anh. Bữa cháo dưới đèn dầu hóa giải khoảng cách gia đình. Đêm đó, nỗi sợ vẫn còn, nhưng sáng hôm sau mở ra sự bình yên mới khi họ cùng chăm sóc khu vườn sau mưa. Cuộc gọi việc làm mang đến hy vọng.